Maya stood frozen in the dark, her phone light shaking in her hand, aimed at a hole in her bedroom wall no bigger than a coin. Behind that wall, something had been watching her sleep for 3 weeks, and in 3 seconds it would knock on her door and pretend it hadn't. The first night Maya Bennett slept in her new apartment, she dreamed of Chicago and woke up certain someone was standing at the foot of her bed. There was no one there. There never was. But it took her 4 full minutes, lying rigid in the dark with her heart slamming against her ribs, to remember that she was 6,000 miles away now, in a city where nobody knew her name, in a life she had built specifically so that this feeling would stop finding her. It had not stopped. It had simply learned to wait. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on post notifications. Very soon, I'll be dropping full HD, long cinematic videos with even better storytelling and visuals. The only support I need from you is a simple subscription and notification bell. That way, when the videos drop, you'll be one of the first to watch. Thank you for being here, and let's get started. Now, let's step back 3 weeks to the ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Maya first hung a picture on her bedroom wall and everything began to unravel. The apartment was smaller than her place in Chicago had been, a 1-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of a mid-rise building in Yeonhwi-dong, chosen specifically because the listing photos showed a quiet, tree-lined street and a building old enough that nobody would expect a foreign woman living alone to have any money worth targeting. Maya had learned, in the 18 months since the restraining order that never actually restrained anyone, to think in those terms. Not what she wanted. What was defensible. She worked as a freelance translator, mostly technical documents and contract law, the kind of work that could be done anywhere with a laptop and a strong enough grasp of both Korean and English to catch the small mistranslations that could cost a company millions. It paid well enough to be picky about apartments and lonely enough that she rarely had a reason to leave hers. That suited her fine. She had spent a year in Chicago flinching every time a car idled too long outside her building, and she had promised herself that whatever life she rebuilt afterward would be small enough to control completely. The apartment had come furnished, mostly, but she'd wanted something of her own on the walls, something that made the space feel chosen rather than merely occupied. She found the frame at a market near Hongdae. A simple black frame around a print of a woman standing at the edge of the sea, and she hung it on the bedroom wall across from her bed on a warm Tuesday afternoon, humming to herself, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, something close to settled. The nail did not want to go in cleanly. The wall gave in an odd way, a soft give behind the plaster that made her stop and press her palm flat against the surface, frowning. She told herself it was probably just an old patch job, the kind of thing you found in buildings this age, and she finished hanging the frame and stepped back to admire it and thought nothing more of it for 6 days. It was the sound that brought her back to it, a faint, intermittent clicking coming from somewhere behind the frame, so quiet she told herself for 2 nights that she'd imagined it, until the 3rd night, lying awake at 2 in the morning with every sense sharpened by 6 years of learning not to trust her own sense of safety, she got up, lifted the frame off its nail, and found a hole in the wall behind it. It was small, no larger than a coin, drilled with the kind of precision that meant a tool, not an accident, and behind the plaster dust still clinging to its edges, catching the light from her phone's flashlight at exactly the wrong angle to be anything other than what it was, sat the dark, unmistakable glint of a camera lens. Maya did not scream. She would think about that later, how strange it was that the loudest moment of her life so far had happened in complete silence, her whole body going cold and still the way it used to when she heard a car door close outside her old apartment at the wrong hour. She stood there in the dark, phone light trembling slightly in her hand, staring at a lens the size of a pinhead aimed directly at the bed she had been sleeping in for 3 weeks, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its total wrongness, that someone on the other side of that wall had been watching her sleep. She did not call the police that night. She sat on the floor of her own bedroom with her back against the bed frame, as far from the wall as the small room allowed, and made herself breathe in the 4-count pattern a Chicago therapist had taught her 2 years earlier, in the 10 months after Marcus Ade decided that Maya's polite refusal of a second date was a puzzle he was entitled to keep solving. It had started small. A comment on a photo she hadn't tagged her location on. A coffee order he shouldn't have known. Then a car in her work parking lot that turned out, when she finally worked up the courage to write down the plate number, to be registered to his mother's address. The police had taken a report. They had also, more than once, asked her what she'd done to encourage him in the particular tone reserved for women who complained about men with otherwise clean records, and by the time a judge finally granted an order of protection, Marcus had already moved twice, quietly, and stopped showing up anywhere Maya could prove. She had left Chicago 11 months later, not because the order failed exactly, but because she had come to understand that a piece of paper could not make her feel safe in a body that no longer trusted its own instincts. Seoul had been her sister Grace's idea, half joking, during a phone call at 2 in the morning when Maya admitted she'd started sleeping with the lights on again. "You speak the language better than most exchange students who actually go," Grace had said. "Go be needed somewhere. Nobody already has an opinion about you." Maya had taken the suggestion more seriously than either of them expected, and 18 months later she was fluent enough to translate corporate contracts for a living and lonely enough that she had, until 6 days ago, considered that loneliness the price of finally feeling safe. She did not tell Grace about the hole in the wall that night. She told herself she would, once she understood what she was actually dealing with. Once she had something more solid than the particular animal terror of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust her own red on a threat until she had proof strong enough to survive being doubted. Her work, in the months since arriving, had become the scaffolding that held the rest of her life upright. Clients rarely needed to meet her in person, and she had built a small, reliable reputation among a handful of law firms and manufacturing companies for catching the kind of contractual ambiguity that could quietly cost a deal millions if left unnoticed. The sort of precision that came, she suspected, from the same part of her mind that had spent a year cataloging license plates and delivery schedules. Back in Chicago, looking for patterns other people missed because they had never needed to look that closely. It was not lost on her, some nights, that the same instinct which had once nearly driven her to a breakdown was now the exact instinct that paid her rent. She had simply pointed it somewhere it could not hurt her anymore, or so she had believed, until 6 days ago, when it turned out the danger had never actually needed her attention pointed anywhere at all. It had simply been waiting behind a wall she had trusted enough to hang a picture on. In the morning, exhausted and hollowed out from a night spent finally sleeping on the living room couch instead, she called the building's landlord, Mrs. Choi, a warm, brisk woman in her 60s who had personally shown Maya the apartment 3 months earlier and had seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of landlord worth trusting. "A camera," Mrs. Choi repeated slowly over the phone, her English careful and precise the way it always was when she was trying to make sure she hadn't misunderstood something important. "In the wall. You are certain?" "I'm certain," Maya said, standing in her kitchen with the frame still leaned against the counter where she'd left it, unable to make herself hang it back up or throw it away. "I need to know who lived in that unit before me, and I need to know who has access to the apartment on the other side of that wall." There was a pause long enough that Maya wondered if the call had dropped. "The other side is Unit 402, Mrs. Choi said finally, her voice careful in a new way now. "That has been empty for 6 weeks. The tenant before you, in your unit, she left very suddenly. I assumed a family matter. She did not collect her deposit." "What was her name?" "Imuna," Mrs. Choi said. "A very quiet young woman. I am sorry, Miss Bennett. I will call the police myself if you would like, and I will have the building's maintenance supervisor look at the wall today. Dushik has worked here 12 years. He will know exactly what we are looking at." Maya thanked her and hung up and stood very still in her kitchen for a long moment, turning that last sentence over in her mind without yet understanding why it had lodged there the way it had, some old, careful instinct flagging a detail she did not yet have the context to properly weigh. She met Kang Ji-woo for the first time that same afternoon in the hallway outside her apartment, and her first genuine thought about him was that he looked like a man built entirely out of locked doors. He lived directly across from her in Unit 405, and in 3 months she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him total, mostly variations of a polite nod and a murmured greeting in the elevator. He was tall, precise in his movements, in a way that suggested either military training or an engineer's discomfort with wasted motion, And he kept his apartment door shut with the particular finality of a man who had decided a long time ago that hallways were not places where anything good happened. That afternoon, coming home from meeting the building's maintenance supervisor, he found Maya standing outside her own door with a drill in one hand and an expression that must have looked, from the outside, somewhere between furious and about to be sick, because he stopped in the middle of the hallway and actually looked at her directly for the first time since she'd moved in. "Are you all right?" he said, not quite a question, in the careful, unaccented English of someone who had spent significant time abroad and had decided, at some point, that speaking it well was safer than admitting how much he understood. "Someone drilled a hole through my bedroom wall and put a camera in it," Maya said, too exhausted and too far past caring about social pleasantness to soften it, watching his face for whatever reaction would tell her something useful. So, no. Not particularly. Something crossed his expression that she couldn't immediately name, quick and controlled, gone before she could decide if it had been shock or something closer to recognition. "Which wall?" he said. "The one facing the hallway toward 402. She watched him carefully. "Empty unit, apparently." "I know it's empty," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice made the back of Maya's neck prickle in a way she recognized instantly, the specific unease of a detail that did not sit quite right yet. "I asked the landlord about renting it myself 6 weeks ago when the last tenant left." "Why would you want a second unit? I didn't get it," he said, which was not, Maya noticed immediately, actually an answer to her question. "Mrs. Choi," said someone else had already inquired. "I assumed it went to a different family." He excused himself shortly after that, retreating into his own apartment with the same brisk, unreadable efficiency with which he'd approached the conversation, and Maya stood alone in the hallway, holding a drill she had bought that morning to seal the hole herself before the police could tell her not to touch it, turning over everything he had just told her with the particular suspicion of a woman who had learned, expensively, not to trust a stranger's calm. He had wanted the empty apartment. He had known it was empty without being told. And when she had described what she'd found, his first reaction had not been surprise. It had been a question about which wall, asked with the specific, clinical precision of a man confirming a detail he already suspected. She did not sleep in her bedroom again that night. She did not, for 3 more days, entirely rule him out either. Detective Song Hae-mi arrived the following morning with a technician, a notepad, and the particular unhurried patience of a woman who had clearly investigated far worse and had no intention of letting Maya see her rattled by the details of this one. She was in her early 40s, compact and precise, and she examined the hole in the wall for a long time before she said anything at all. "The lens has been removed," Detective Song said finally, crouching beside the baseboard with a small flashlight angled into the cavity behind the plaster. "Recently. There is residue here consistent with a fiber optic camera, the kind sold for home inspection use, easily purchased, easily hidden, and easily pulled the moment someone suspects they've been found. Whoever installed this knew you were onto it before you called us." "How would they know that?" Maya asked, though even as she said it, she understood the answer had been standing outside her door yesterday afternoon, watching her hold a drill with an expression she could not read. "That is the question I would like answered too," Detective Song said, making a note. "This building has a shared maintenance closet on each floor with wiring access to adjoining units. It is not difficult, for someone who knows the building's layout, to access a neighboring wall from inside that closet without ever needing a key to the apartment itself. I will need a full list of anyone with access to those closets. Building staff, previous tenants, anyone who has done renovation work recently." Mrs. Choi, hovering anxiously in the doorway, supplied the information with visible distress. The maintenance closets were accessed with a master key held by exactly 3 people. Herself, the building's day porter, and Han Du-shik, the maintenance supervisor who had, Mrs. Choi added, personally checked the wall in Unit 402 only 6 weeks earlier after the previous tenant reported a plumbing issue that turned out, upon inspection, to be nothing at all. Detective Song wrote the name down without visible reaction, though Maya noticed the small pause before her pen moved again, the same pause a good translator learns to catch in a sentence that has just quietly changed its own meaning. "I would like to speak with Im Yuna," Detective Song said. "The previous tenant of this unit? Do you have a forwarding address for her? Mrs. Choi did not. Im had left in the middle of the night, according to the building's night porter, taking 2 suitcases and leaving behind furniture, dishes, and an unopened stack of mail that Mrs. Choi had been meaning, guiltily, to forward for 2 months and had simply never gotten around to. I would like that mail, Detective Song said, and something in her tone told Maya this was no longer a request being made politely. Kang Ji-woo appeared in the hallway just as Detective Song was leaving, standing in his own doorway with an expression carefully arranged into neutral curiosity, and Maya watched Detective Song's gaze move over him once, quick and assessing, the particular look of a professional cataloging a stranger for later without yet deciding what to do with him. Do you know the man across the hall? Detective Song asked quietly once they were alone in the stairwell. Not really, Maya admitted. He asked about renting the empty unit before I found the camera. He knew it was vacant before anyone told him. And when I told him what I'd found, his first question was, which wall? Not, are you okay? Not what happened. Which wall? Detective Song's expression did not change, but she made another note, unhurried and deliberate. I will look into him, she said. I would ask you to be careful around him in the meantime, without accusing him of anything you cannot yet prove. In my experience, Miss Bennett, the person who behaves strangely and the guilty person are not always the same person, but they are also not always different people. We will find out which one he is. The stack of forwarded mail Mrs. Choi finally produced 2 days later was mostly unremarkable, a handful of delivery notices and a phone bill and an unopened bank statement, but tucked at the very bottom, wedged into a gap between 2 catalogs as though someone had wanted it hidden without wanting to admit to hiding it, was a small spiral notebook with a torn cover and Im-Yuna's name written inside, the front page in careful, cramped handwriting. Detective Song read it first, alone, before allowing Maya to see it, and when she finally handed it over, her expression had the particular stillness of someone choosing her words to avoid causing unnecessary harm. She suspected something similar to what happened to you, Detective Song said. She never used the word camera. She wrote about a clicking sound behind her bedroom wall and a feeling of being watched that she could not prove and worried on the page that no one would believe. She wrote that Du Shik came to check the wall twice, and that both times the sound stopped for exactly 1 week before returning. Maya read the notebook that evening alone in her kitchen, unable to make herself sit in the bedroom, even with the hole sealed and the police report filed, and found, in Im-Yuna's careful, increasingly frightened handwriting, a portrait of her own last 3 weeks reflected backward through someone else's eyes. The same clicking, the same 2 a.m. wakings, a line, 3 pages from the end, that made Maya set the notebook down and press both hands flat against the kitchen counter to steady herself. I think he's done this before. I found a hairpin behind the dresser that isn't mine and isn't anything I've ever owned, like whoever lived here before me left it, or like whoever put the camera there took it off someone else first and forgot it was still in his pocket. There was no explanation, in the notebook, for why Im-Yuna had left so suddenly. The entries simply stopped, mid-page, the handwriting on the final entry looser and more frightened than anything before it, 3 lines that read only, "He knows I know. I have to go tonight. I'm sorry to whoever moves in after me." Detective Song's investigation, moving with the careful, unhurried thoroughness Maya had initially mistaken for slowness, turned up 2 more names within the week, previous tenants of units on the 3rd and 6th floors, both of whom had moved out within 18 months of arriving. Both of whom, when finally located and gently questioned, admitted to a version of the same story. Strange sounds, an unshakable sense of being watched, a maintenance supervisor who checked on things a little too often and knew a little too much about their schedules, and, in both cases, a decision to simply leave rather than risk not being believed. 3 prior tenants, Detective Song said, laying the pattern out across Maya's kitchen table with the same careful rows she'd used for the mail. Possibly more we haven't found yet. All young women living alone. All in units Han Du-shik had legitimate reason to access. And all of them chose to disappear quietly rather than make an accusation against a man everyone in this building considers reliable and kind. She looked up at Maya directly. You are the first one who didn't run. If tonight's story has you as unsettled as it has us, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you the kind of mysteries that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Now, let's find out exactly what happens when Maya decides not to be the fourth woman who simply disappears. She confronted Kang Ji-woo the following evening, standing in the hallway between their two doors with Im-yuna's notebook still fresh enough in her mind that her voice came out sharper than she intended. "You wanted Unit 402, she said. "You knew it was empty before anyone told you. And your first question, when I told you what happened to me, was which wall. I need you to tell me why. And I need you to understand that I have already given your name to a detective, so whatever you say next, she is going to hear about it too." Something in his careful composure finally cracked, not into anger, but into something closer to exhaustion, the specific tiredness of a man who had been guarding a wound for so long that defending it had become its own kind of habit. "My sister lived alone in an apartment very much like this one, 4 years ago," he said quietly, leaning against his own doorframe as though he needed it to stay upright. "A man in her building became fixated on her. She reported it 3 times. The police did nothing meaningful, because he had never technically broken in, never technically touched her, only watched and followed and left small signs that he had been closer than she knew. She stopped believing anyone would help her before she stopped believing she was in danger, which I have come to think is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a person being stalked. She died in a car accident 6 months later, driving too fast, alone, at night, running from something the report never officially connected to him, though I have never once believed it was unrelated." He looked at Maya directly for the first time since she'd known him, something raw moving behind his usually controlled expression. "I design building security systems now. It is the only thing I know how to do with what happened to her that does not simply make me angry at every locked door I cannot personally check. When I heard this unit had strange reports from its previous tenant, I wanted to look at it myself, professionally, before another family moved in without knowing what they were walking into. I did not get the chance. The landlord assumed I only wanted extra storage space and gave it to someone else's inquiry instead, someone who never actually followed through. When you told me about the camera, I asked which wall because I already suspected exactly which wall it would be. I have been watching this building's maintenance patterns for 6 weeks, Miss Bennett, not to hurt you, to find whatever I could not find in time for my sister." Maya stood in the hallway for a long moment, the anger she had been carrying draining out of her all at once and leaving something more complicated in its place. "Why didn't you just tell me that from the beginning?" "Because the last time I told a stranger why I do what I do," he said quietly, "she looked at me like I was the dangerous one for having a dead sister I couldn't stop thinking about. It was easier to let you suspect me of something I didn't do than to watch you flinch away from the truth of what actually happened to her." Detective Song, informed of the conversation the next morning, spent 2 additional days quietly verifying every detail before finally, formally, crossing Kang Ji-woo's name off her list. His sister's case file, when requested from the relevant precinct, matched his account exactly, down to the 3 ignored reports and the unrelated accident report that had closed a case everyone privately suspected should never have been closed at all. "He is not your suspect," Detective Song told Maya plainly. "But I would be careful all the same about how much you let him inside this investigation from here forward. Grief makes people reckless in ways that guilt sometimes disguises as courage. He may want justice for his sister more than he wants safety for you, and those 2 goals do not always point in the same direction." Maya thought about that warning longer than she expected to, mostly because some quiet, careful part of her recognized the shape of it from the inside. She, too, had spent a year wanting justice more than safety, right up until the moment safety had become the only thing she could still afford to want. Han Du-shik had fixed Maya's leaking kitchen faucet the week she moved in, replaced a flickering hallway bulb without being asked, and once, during a particularly brutal summer heat wave, quietly left a small box of iced barley tea outside her door with a handwritten note that said only, for the new tenant, "Stay cool." Every resident in the building, when Detective Song discreetly asked around, described him in nearly identical terms: reliable, generous, endlessly patient, the kind of man you called at midnight for a broken pipe, and who never once made you feel like an inconvenience for asking. That reputation, Detective Song explained to Maya over coffee in a cafe 2 blocks from the building, chosen specifically for its distance from anyone who might recognize either of them, was precisely what had let him operate undetected for years. "People do not suspect kindness," she said. "They suspect strangeness, standoffishness, the things that make them uncomfortable in a way they can name. A man who fixes your faucet and remembers your birthday does not fit the shape most people have been taught to fear." That is not an accident, Miss Bennett. That reputation is the tool he has built most carefully of all. The formal interview, conducted at the precinct under the polite fiction of a routine building safety inquiry, revealed nothing directly incriminating. Dushik answered every question with the same warm, slightly bewildered helpfulness he brought to every interaction, expressed genuine-seeming horror at the idea that any tenant had been made to feel unsafe, and volunteered, unprompted, to assist however the investigation required. Detective Song watched him carefully throughout, noting afterward that his hands had remained perfectly steady the entire time, an observation she found more concerning than reassuring. "Guilty men are usually nervous," she told Maya afterward. "Practiced men are not. He has done this enough times to know exactly how an innocent man is supposed to behave, and he performed it flawlessly. That tells me more about him than anything he actually said." The break came 4 days later, not from the investigation itself, but from Maya's own decision to do something Detective Song had not exactly sanctioned. Unable to sit still with the growing certainty that the man who had left tea outside her door was the same man who had watched her sleep, she began quietly cataloging every interaction she'd had with Dushik since arriving, cross-referencing dates against the entries in Imuna's notebook, and found a pattern that made her blood run cold. Every time the clicking sound in the wall had stopped, according to Yuna's notebook, it had been exactly 1 week after Dushik supposedly repaired something unrelated in the apartment. He was not simply accessing the wall through the maintenance closet. He was using legitimate repair visits as cover to check on and adjust the equipment directly, comfortable enough in his own home advantage that he had stopped bothering to hide the pattern from anyone who thought to look for it. She brought the timeline to Detective Song the next morning, and for the first time since the investigation began, the detective's careful composure showed something like genuine alarm. "If this pattern holds," Detective Song said, studying the dates Maya had laid out, "he checked your unit's camera 3 days ago under the pretense of fixing a doorknob that was never actually broken, which means he already knows we have taken the notebook from Imuna's forwarded mail because he would have noticed the camera was gone during that visit and understood exactly what that meant." She looked up sharply. "Miss Bennett, has anyone unfamiliar approached you in the last 3 days? Followed you? Anything at all? However small?" Maya's mouth went dry as she remembered, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, a man on the subway platform 2 mornings earlier, standing slightly too close, whose face she had not properly registered at the time because she had been reading a translation contract on her phone and had simply assumed he was waiting for the next train like everyone else. "I think he's already found out we're on to him," she said quietly. "I think he has been watching to see what we do next." She told Kang Ji-woo that evening, sitting across from him at the small table in his apartment, the first time she had ever been inside it, spare and precisely organized in a way that told her more about the shape of his grief than anything he had said out loud. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his jaw tightened in a way that made her understand, for the first time, exactly how much restraint it was costing him not to walk across the hall and confront Dushik directly. "If you do that," Maya said, reading the impulse plainly on his face, "you will hand him exactly the excuse he needs to claim harassment and delay everything Detective Song has spent 2 weeks building carefully enough to actually hold up in court. I need you to want justice for your sister more than you want to feel useful tonight, Ji-woo. Those are not the same thing, and I need you to know the difference before you do something we can't undo." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, some of the tightness had eased out of his shoulders, replaced by something more deliberate. "Then tell me what would actually help." Detective Song, briefed the following morning on both the subway incident and Dushik's apparent awareness that his cover had been compromised, made a decision she admitted was not without risk. "We do not have enough, yet, for an arrest that will survive a defense attorney. she said, laying out a plan across Maya's kitchen table with the same careful precision she brought to everything. He removed the camera before we found it installed. Without catching him in the act of installing a replacement or accessing the space again with clear intent, everything we have remains circumstantial. I would like to give him a reason to try again under conditions we control completely. The plan, once assembled, was simple in structure and considerably harder to actually live inside. Maya would announce, loudly and to multiple people, including Mrs. Choi, that she was traveling for a translation conference for 4 days, creating a window in which an empty apartment might tempt a man who had already proven he could not resist checking on his own handiwork. Detective Song's technical unit would install a discreet, professionally monitored camera in the hallway maintenance closet itself, the one piece of the building Du Shik could not avoid using to access the wall, and Maya would remain, in reality, hidden in Jiwoo's apartment across the hall for the duration, close enough to be moved to safety instantly if anything went wrong. I do not love asking a civilian to be this close to the operation, Detective Song admitted, but 4 days of surveillance from a distance risks giving him time to notice something is wrong and disappear the way he has clearly helped others disappear before. I would rather this happen quickly and carefully, with you somewhere Officer Kang can reach in seconds if needed. Jiwoo, when the detail was mentioned, did not comment on being referred to by a title he had never actually held, though Maya noticed the corner of his mouth twitch in something almost like dark amusement, gone as quickly as it appeared. The first 2 nights passed in tense, uneventful silence, Maya sitting on the floor of Jiwoo's apartment with the hallway camera feed open on Detective Song's borrowed tablet, watching an empty maintenance closet do nothing at all while her own nerves stretched thinner with every passing hour. Jiwoo sat beside her through most of it, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary, occasionally making tea neither of them finished. And somewhere in the second night, exhausted and raw, in a way she had not let herself be around anyone since Chicago, Maya found herself telling him the parts of her own story she had never said aloud to a stranger before. The parking lot, the plate number, the judge's tired eyes granting an order that never actually kept anyone away. "You didn't run because you were weak," Jiwoo said quietly when she finished. "You ran because the system built to protect you had already failed twice. Choosing to leave was not the same thing as choosing to be a victim. I think you have been carrying a version of that mistake for a long time without ever putting it down." "And what have you been carrying?" Maya asked. "The idea that I could have saved her if I had simply been paying closer attention," he admitted. "I have built an entire career trying to prove that theory correct, one security system at a time, and I am beginning to understand, sitting here tonight, that some things are simply not preventable by vigilance alone. Sometimes the only thing that actually works is someone finally being believed." It was on the 3rd night, at 1:47 in the morning, that the hallway camera feed showed movement. Han Du-shik moved through the hallway with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed, completely, that he was alone in a building he had spent 12 years learning to think of as more his than anyone else's. He let himself into the maintenance closet with his own key, and Maya, watching the tablet screen with her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, saw him remove a small toolbox and a familiar-looking length of fiber optic cable, exactly the kind Detective Song's technician had described 3 days earlier. "That's it," she whispered. "That's him." Jiwoo was already reaching for his phone to alert Detective Song, who had been parked 2 streets away in an unmarked car for exactly this possibility, when the closet door opened again and Du-shik stepped fully into frame, close enough to the hidden camera that his face filled most of the screen, calm and methodical, entirely unaware that the very wall he trusted was finally, for the first time in 12 years, watching him back. Detective Song and 2 uniformed officers reached the 4th floor within 4 minutes, moving with a speed and quiet coordination that told Maya this was a moment they had rehearsed carefully in every version their planning could anticipate. Du-shik was still inside the closet, cable in hand, when Detective Song's flashlight caught him directly, and the expression that crossed his face in that instant, caught clean on the hallway camera's recording, was not fear, Maya would think later, watching the footage during the eventual trial. It was something closer to genuine confusion, the specific bewilderment of a man who had spent so long believing his own reputation would protect him indefinitely that being caught seemed, to him like an error in the natural order of things rather than a consequence he had ever seriously considered. "Mr. Han," Detective Song said, her voice carrying the particular calm she reserved for moments that required absolute control, "you are being detained on suspicion of unlawful surveillance and stalking under the Act on the Punishment of Stalking Crimes. I would ask you to set down what you are holding and come with us without incident." He did not resist. Exactly. Though what followed was not quite compliance either, a long, strange monologue delivered in a steady, almost wounded tone as the officers secured the toolbox and its contents as evidence. "I never touched any of them," he said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of them at once. "I only wanted to know they were all right." Living alone, in a foreign country, so far from anyone who would notice if something happened to them. Someone needed to be paying attention. Someone needed to actually care. "That is not caring," Ji-woo said quietly, stepping into the hallway despite Detective Song's earlier instruction to remain out of sight, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made even the officers pause. "My sister needed someone who actually cared, and instead she got a man exactly like you, who convinced himself that watching was the same thing as protecting. It is not the same thing. It was never the same thing. It's why she's dead, and it's why you're finally in handcuffs instead of fixing another faucet tomorrow morning as nothing happened." Du-shik looked at him for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might, in a different man, have been remorse, and said nothing at all in response, which Maya would later think was somehow worse than any excuse he might have offered instead. The search of his own apartment, conducted the following morning under a warrant Detective Song had prepared in advance for exactly this outcome, produced a locked drawer containing years of recordings, carefully labeled by unit number and date, along with the notebook they had already recovered from Imuna's mail, and, tucked at the very back, a small collection of items Detective Song would later confirm belonged to at least 4 different women who had lived in that building over the past decade, kept, Du-shik would eventually admit under further questioning, not as trophies exactly, but as proof, in his own words, that he had been paying attention to someone. The trial took 4 months to reach a verdict, and Maya sat through every session she was permitted to attend, watching Han Du-shik's carefully cultivated reputation dismantled piece by piece as 4 separate women. 3 of them tracked down through the labeled recordings in his drawer, and encouraged by Detective Song's careful, patient outreach, finally testified to years of fear they had each believed. Privately, no one would ever be willing to prosecute. Im-yuna, located eventually through a cousin in Busan, sent a written statement rather than appearing in person, though she asked Detective Song to pass along one line to Maya specifically once the trial concluded. "Thank you for not running the way I did. I am sorry it took someone else's courage to finally make mine count for something." Han Du-shik was convicted on multiple counts under the Stalking Punishment Act, along with additional charges related to unlawful surveillance and the collection of evidence found in his apartment, and sentenced to a term long enough that Mrs. Choi, tearful and apologetic in a way that bordered on inconsolable, personally oversaw the replacement of every lock, camera, and maintenance access protocol in the building before another tenant was permitted to move in behind Maya's newly resealed wall. Mrs. Choi came to Maya's apartment the week after sentencing, sitting stiffly at the kitchen table with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, and apologized in the careful, formal Korean she usually reserved for matters she considered too important to risk losing anything in translation. "I trusted him with keys to every home in this building for 12 years, she said. "I never once asked myself what a man does with that kind of trust when no one is watching him hold it. I am ashamed that it took a stranger from another country to notice what I should have questioned a long time ago." Maya did not have an easy answer for her, only the quiet observation that trust extended in good faith was not the same thing as guilt, a distinction she had spent a great deal of the past year learning to draw for herself as well. Mrs. Choi cried anyway, and Maya let her, understanding by then that some kinds of guilt simply needed somewhere honest to land before they could finally be set down. Maya did not move out. She had expected, in the weeks immediately following the arrest, that she would. That the apartment would feel permanently contaminated by what had happened inside it, the way her Chicago apartment had felt for the 11 months she'd forced herself to keep living there before finally admitting defeat. Instead, standing in her freshly repainted bedroom 3 weeks after the trial concluded, watching afternoon light fall across a wall that no longer held anything behind it but plaster and old brick, she found something had shifted in her that she had not expected to feel again so soon. The specific, uncomplicated relief of a space that finally actually belonged to her. "I keep waiting to feel like I have to leave," she admitted to Jiwoo one evening, the two of them sitting on her small balcony with tea neither of them had gotten around to drinking. A habit, she realized. They had carried over from 3 tense nights spent watching a hallway camera together and never quite let go of afterward. "Every time something like this has happened to me before, leaving was the only ending I knew how to write for myself. And now?" Jiwoo asked. "Now I think I'd rather stay and watch the story become something else," she said. "Even if I don't know yet what that looks like." What it looked like, over the months that followed, was smaller and steadier than either of them might have predicted at the start of it all. Jiwoo began consulting for Mrs. Choi's building on a proper security overhaul, the first project of its kind he had taken on that felt. He admitted to Maya one evening, less like penance and more like actually building something forward instead of only guarding against the past. He visited his sister's grave that spring for the first time in 2 years and asked Maya, hesitantly, if she would come with him. And she did, standing quietly beside him in a small cemetery outside the city while he said, out loud, for the first time, everything he had spent 4 years only saying to himself. Detective Song stopped by the apartment complex once more after the case formally closed, not for any remaining professional reason, she admitted a little stiffly, but because she had found herself wanting to see, with her own eyes, that the ending of this particular file had actually held. She found Maya and Jiwoo on the building's small shared rooftop garden, planting something neither of them seemed entirely confident would survive the season, and something in the detective's usually composed expression eased at the sight of it in a way she did not bother trying to hide. "I do not always get invited back to see how these stories end," she said, accepting a cup of tea Maya had started keeping on hand specifically for these visits. "I am glad this is one I got to see finished properly, instead of only ever seeing the file get closed on paper." Maya called her sister Grace that same week and told her, for the first time, the whole story from the beginning. The hole in the wall, the notebook, the hallway camera, the trial, all of it. And when she finished, Grace was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "You didn't run this time," Grace said finally, something thick in her voice that Maya recognized as the particular relief of a sister who had spent 2 years quietly afraid the next phone call might be the one that finally broke something in Maya for good. "No," Maya agreed. "I think I finally found something worth staying for instead." She kept Imuna's notebook in a drawer long after the trial concluded, not out of any need to relive what it contained, but because it had taught her something she suspected she would need reminding of for the rest of her life. That the difference between disappearing and surviving was rarely about how frightened a person had been. It was about whether, in the moment fear told her to make herself small enough to vanish completely, she had found even one person willing to stand in the hallway beside her instead and insist, quietly but completely, that this time someone was finally going to believe her. If tonight's story reminded you that courage sometimes looks like simply refusing to disappear quietly, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which moment unsettled you the most. The hole behind the frame, the notebook in the mail, or the hallway camera finally watching him back. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the very next unforgettable story.